I always forget to unmute my mic, but I always remember. Hello, Demi and Goose fans. It is me, Candace. I am here coming at you live from my house because it's 9 p.m. I am in my pajamas, but you can't really tell, but I'm in my pajamas. And I'm so excited to do this author event this evening. And I am so glad that y'all are here as well because I am speaking with Neon Yang, who is one of the best-selling authors in our store. I know we have lots of fans out there of them, and so I'm a fan too, and I'm very excited. Neon is the author of the Tensorate Series of novellas from Tor.com. And so that's The Black Tides of Heaven, which I know a lot of you have read because it's the best-selling book in the store for a couple years. The Red Threads of Fortune, The Descent of Monsters, and The Ascent to Godhood are the 4 books. And a bind-up of all 4 has just come out, so it's very exciting. Neon's work has been shortlisted for the Hugo, Nebula, World Fantasy, Lambda Literary, and Locus Awards. And the Tensorate novellas were a Tiptree honoree in 2018. They have over 24 works of short fiction published in places like Tor.com, Uncanny Magazine, Lightspeed, Clark's World, and Strange Horizons. In previous incarnations, they have been a molecular biologist, which is really cool, a writer for animation, comics, and games, even cooler, a science communicator, and a journalist for one of Singapore's national papers. Neon is currently based out of Singapore, and it is morning time for them and evening time for us. So welcome, Neon. Thank you so much for...
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
And how early in the morning is it there?
It's actually not that early. It's like 10 a.m.
Oh,
so
okay.
it's just
so
like,
it's
you know,
okay.
time for people to work and stuff.
Right, exactly. Well, today, like what I like about the Tensorate series, for those of you who haven't read it, I'm just going to like give you a bunch of stuff that's in it, right? So there's rebellious, non-binary scions of empire, sky-spanning nagas, and they have experimental souls, which is really cool. Revolutionary engineers that are bent on bringing power to the people. There are pugilist monks. Yes, pugilist monks. There are like packs of loyal raptors that follow around this part. It's amazing. Anyway, so these are just like things that you can find in these novels and novellas, sorry. And there's 4 of them, and they're all bound up in this book now. So I'm really excited about this. So Neon, for folks that may not know anything about this series, could you like introduce us to it and just overall what it's about?
Oh goodness. It's kind of hard to say, I think, what the books are about, because each of them are like slightly different, and what they're about is kind of different. But the Tensorate series is basically a secondary world, sort of like Asian inspired fantasy, in which there is this, it's an empire that is doing empire stuff, and the protector is kind of like a tyrant, who is not a very good person. And then so the most of the story revolves around the lives of like the protector and her children, who, and in this world, magic users are called tensors, and they do stuff with something called the slack, which is like, you know, the force or whatever. But it's something that you can be trained to use, but the training is basically accessible mostly to people who are upper class and stuff like that. So it's not like, you know, you're either born with it or you're not. It can be cultivated, and that has also a point of sort of like social contention. And the machinists are people who want to use like technology to sort of narrow the gap between the haves and have-nots, and there's like rebellion and stuff against the protectorate. And that's kind of like the gist of the stories. You know, there's a lot of family drama, there's a lot of queer stuff, because, you know, I have to write stuff that's like extremely gay. And yeah, Dinosaurs and Dragons because I love dinosaurs and dragons, and there's like no reason for them to be in the book because other than the fact that I love dinosaurs and dragons, so they're in there. Yeah.
I mean, I sell this book almost solely with queers with a dinosaur like army, and people are like, "Oh my gosh, okay, I will immediately buy it."
Yeah, I need to write more of those books because I'm like, yes, it's just a good concept.
It's a very good concept, and the
Where's
cover
the large deadly creatures at the beck and call?
amazing
For me.
exactly. And the covers of these books are amazing. The covers are so beautiful, and so it also makes it really easy. And the cover of the new bind up, I can show everyone that. Of course, I left my copy of it at the bookstore because that's just how it happens.
I have a copy of it here. I do. Sorry.
Here we go.
All right.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
Just the covers. Like, how much input did you have on these covers?
So Yuko Shimizu, who is the artist for these covers, has done an amazing job, and she was picked by the Tor.com team, who have done an amazing job. The first time I saw the covers for I think Black Tides and Red Threads, I kind of like couldn't talk for like a whole minute because I could not believe that these were going to be the covers. I did for the first two. I think I did have quite a lot of input. Like they asked me for visual references and stuff like that, so I sent them like a bunch of reference pictures, and I think they did like an amazing job. Like I could never have imagined like in 100 years that the covers would be so good, and I feel like the covers themselves sold like a fair number of the books because like people would be just like, oh, what's that? That's really cool, which I'm not complaining about. So like, yeah, I'm so grateful, and I always will be for like the amazing covers to all these books because they are literally just works of art on their own. So like, incredible.
And I can attest that people have bought this book from my store just for the cover. Like they'll, I mean, I do throw it at people, but also they'll bring it up. They'll be like, "This cover was just so pretty," and I'll be like, "Yes, you will not regret buying this book, though." So can you tell us, you mentioned the Slack and your magic system that anyone can learn, which I really love. So but it's really, really hard to learn. And it requires like years to master it. And I'm just wondering, why did you set it up that way versus something that you could be born with?
I think it's partially because of like, it's got sort of like a wuxia, ciencia kind of like background, right? Because that's kind of what I was drawing from. And a lot of these things that you can basically train yourself into developing certain techniques and stuff. Like there is stuff that is like, you were born with it, like, you were born like, how supernatural or whatever, and then you have all these like magical powers, but you can also like sort of like there's a concept of Chunxia, which is sort of like attaining immortality. It's sort of like these I don't want to say Chinese fantasy, but it's a concept that I think that I wanted to sort of bring across, and also it was a useful tool, I guess, in a sense that it let me sort of like play around with the idea that what a lot of people think of as like sort of like natural talents, in this capitalist world that we have, is not actually natural talent, but just like, being born into the right social strata and having the opportunities given to you. So that's something that I wanted to play with, and I think this kind of idea that education is always sort of raises a way to sort of like lift yourself out of poverty, but like we don't get equal education, right? The education that you receive often depends on which socioeconomic class you were born into. So that's kind of something that I wanted to play with. As for like the Slack crafts itself, the magic system itself, I sort of built it to be kind of as scientific as possible. So each of the various sort of like, there are different schools, different types of sled crafting. And each one sort of like corresponds to a certain type of like energy that if you take a physics class, it's like there's like I actually cannot remember what the 5 or 6 classes were specifically, but I know there was like electromagnetic energy, there was gravitational energy and stuff like that. So yeah, I wanted to build a magic system that was kind of scientific, because I do have a science background, so it was easier for me to sort of like compartmentalize and say, okay, what can and what can you not do with this magic system, which also made plotting easier, because then you don't have to sort of like invent like weird spells and arcane magic on the go, because you're sort of like you already have a framework to work with that's kind of like based on real world, so it's easier. Yeah,
that's awesome. And yeah, I had always wanted that, because I love that, because like in most fantasy, you just magic is just something that you have, right? And I love this like scientific magic system that you had. I just love them. N.K. Jemisin does like these kind of scientific magic systems also. I love it. I love anytime that it kind of gets into a little bit of science. It's fun.
I tend to write stuff that's based more or less like science fantasy, because it will have science fiction aspects to it, but there's also like magic and fantasy, sort of secondary world fantasy stuff. So I tend to like just kind of like, I don't really like writing pure fantasy or pure science fiction, but like kind of like walking in the middle and like picking and choosing what I want from either what we consider to be either genre, which is fun.
Yeah, and that's my favorite kind of stuff to read, like things that sort of walk the line between fantasy and science fiction are very cool. And I was also wondering about your world building, because you had, I've been following you on Twitter for a long time, and you had a Twitter thread a long time ago that you probably don't remember, but that's fine. Doesn't matter for this. But in the Twitter thread, you mentioned that it was a Twitter thread about world building, and you mentioned that you actually didn't do any historical research for these books. So I am just like wondering about your world building process and like how you came up with all this stuff, I guess.
Yeah. So I think there were a few sort of like questions tied up into that sort of like question that I questioned twice in the same sentence. But there are a few like issues kind of like tied up into that question, in that one of them is like what's about authenticity in sort of like I think the thread itself that you were referring to, I actually do kind of remember what I was saying in it, and that thread was about how like people of color, especially when they're sort of like drawing from what people think of as their like sort of native culture, which is and it's different from what's considered mainstream. They're expected to sort of also become teachers, like safari tour guides to people from non-marginalized communities, to sort of like learn, to be like, oh, hey, learn stuff about like, my particular heritage and background by reading this fiction books. And my idea was that I don't think we should do that. I mean, we don't really read like, sword and sorcery fantasy to learn about like, medieval Europe or whatever, because like we know that it's not accurate. We know that it's like fantasy and it's just made up shit. So I think the point of that thread is that marginalized authors from different backgrounds should not have the onus to also be like a history and sort of like a sociology teacher, like sort of give us space to also have that kind of fun. And I think I raised the idea of like my own Tensorate series, which was not actually based on any like historical research, but my recollections is growing up and like the kind of media that I was exposed to as a child, all the like the weird wuxia stuff and Journey to the West and stuff that kind of like made up the tapestry of my childhood media exposure. And so I think that was kind of like the driving a thesis behind that thread. And how I do world building is that I am actually someone who is very, very, I would say opposed. I've like resisted personally to historical fiction or like stuff that's actually based on historical precedents, because it just doesn't work for me. It's not that I think there's anything wrong with it. I have actually tried to do this because my original novel was actually sort of like the novel that I'll have published next year started life off as a historical AU. It was like Chinese Joan of Arc. I actually did so much historical research. I bought a bunch of books. I went to France. I went and climbed like a dozen medieval asphalt staircases. By the way, they're terrifying. And I feared for my life the entire time. And then I discovered that I just can't write historical fiction at all. Like, it's just, I I think I thrive in spaces where I can actually pick and choose what I want to do for my societal structures, how people do things, because I think it's interesting for me to sort of like make like kind of like twisted reflections of what we see in the real world, which the strength of doing it as a secondary world thing, and not as a historical thing, is that I get to pick and choose and focus on stuff, and then not have to worry about other things that you might have to worry about if you were doing historical fiction, because you're actually trying to set it in places that are real, and like, you know, people in the real world have connections too, so you have an obligation to sort of like reflect those accurately. Whereas with like secondary world fiction, you're just like, no, I will do what I want. And you know, if you have your own sort of agenda when you come to like associate projects that I want to talk about this thing specifically, it's easier to sort of like just isolate it and sort of like build everything around that concept. So for me, I think world building, a lot of it tends to go with the plot, what you want to do as a writer for the project. Having said that, I also like the freedom of just being able to include things, because why the hell not? Like, you know, raptors. Why the hell not? I always say that the Tensorate series, the major influences were actually like Dragon Age Inquisition and Jurassic Park. Not that you could tell from like, you know, the covers and like the environments, but like, yes, dragons and dinosaurs. I love them.
I love this so much. I do too. Dragons and dinosaurs are some of my favorite things. So to throw them both in, it's like, yes, you figured this out.
Yeah.
And so another question I have about the novellas is that each one sort of varies in structure. And so the first one is pretty conventional and it's linear. And then the second one stitches together 4 different stories. The third one is letters. And then the last one is a monologue, basically. So I'm just wondering how the story came together for you, and why did you choose to vary the structures that way?
That's such an interesting question, because I think it takes you to sort of like the publication journey. For me, I actually only started writing one novella, which was actually Red Threads, which I was like the first. Well, it's canonically considered now the second novella, but it's the first one that I wrote. And that was the one that's like with a very traditional structure. It takes place over a course of 3 days, and you know, things happen. Sorry, oh my god, things happen. You know, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's the end, you know, there's a rising, falling climax and stuff like that. And it was like the first time I've written anything of that length, about 40,000 words, because before that I was strictly a short story writer, and it was through my short stories that my editor Carl like sort of approached me, and he was like, I am, you know, I'm acquiring for Tor.com publishing, and you know, if you have anything that is in the off novella length, I would love to see it. And so I actually wrote this because I was just like, okay, I should actually, you know, send him stuff. So I wrote this during my my MA year when I was in the UK. I did my MA creative writing, and I sort of did this as the side on the side. Sorry, while you know, doing schoolwork and stuff, and that became the Red Threads of Fortune. That's the title of the book. And when we were selling it, my agent, Dongwon, they were like, let's sell this as a duology, because like I told them that yeah, I definitely do have more stories in this world, because while I was writing it, so Mukuya was the protagonist of that novella in Red Threads, but I also wanted to tell the story of Akeha, her sibling, a twin. And I was just like, I could write a book about that. And so they sold the novellas as two novellas, and Tor decided to do the interesting thing where they were like, we will publish both of them on the same day, and it was like a publishing experience, experiment, because Tor.com publishing does a lot of these interesting publishing experiments because of the structure of the way they're set up, and so I wrote. So I planned Black Tides after that, and because it was sort of like it was. So Red Threads itself was like, a story about a series of events to which introduced you to these characters. But for me, from the start, like Black Tides was always a story of a person. And for me, a story of a person is something that's told over a great number of years, like from childhood and all the to like adulthood and all the sort of like turning points along the way. So I decided to tell it is a series of 4 sort of like snippets of these turning points at different points in Akeha's life. So I actually, it's still one of my favorite novellas because it allowed me to sort of like play along with voice. That I wanted each of these segments to have a slightly different voice. I don't know if I did it very well, but I was quite pleased with the results at that time. I wanted the voice to sort of like reflect Akiha's sort of like internal where they were at, mentally at that point of time. And it was interesting to sort of, it was actually one of those books that I actually never really had to edit that much. Like the first draft that I completed was more or less very similar to the final draft. Red Threads, I actually rewrote the whole thing like several times before sending off, and then like after I finished writing Black Tides, I was just like, I need to rewrite this because I need to bring them up to like sort of the same level of like polish in terms of prose crafting and storytelling and stuff like that. So I actually rewrote it in like a month and a half.
Oh my gosh.
Like, we've already copy edited this book, you know that, right? I was just like, yeah, but I have to. So it was a very stressful like December for me. I just like kind of like slept 3 hours and a day at some points, but I got it done in time. And then as the books are publishing, we talked about doing some more novellas in the series because they could see that there was some interest in the first 2 books, and I thought that yeah, that's great. I want to experiment more with the sort of the format of the novella, because I think in the novella as it is an interesting kind of genre in which it's not so much a form per se, but it's something that like it's a combination of very long short stories and very short novels. Like I think it's a category that was basically, well, the way what we think of as novellas is a category that's kind of like invented basically by awards by awards categories, because like the whole like it has to be within this, like, but within that space I think you have a lot of different forms you can play with. So I wanted to do something different with something that was like novella length, but also I didn't want to tell like a straight up just like long form things happen kind of thing. So I actually proposed like one novella that would be like entirely, I forgot the word for told by letters. It starts with epi blah blah.
Yeah. Epistolary.
Epistolary. I was like, epidemiologically, that is not the word I am thinking of. Yeah, epistolary. That's one that was like entirely told through letters, entirely epistolary. And another one that was just like a single monologue, like, someone just sitting in a bar and telling their life story to someone else over the course of the night. And so that's what I proposed. And for the third one, the Scent of Monsters, I don't remember my
Yes,
title.
that's right. That's right. That's
Fun
right.
fact. And for the set, it was I originally wrote it as completely just through letters. That did not work. I handed in the draft, and Carl was like, "This is terrible," and I'm like, "Yeah, I know. I'm sorry." I actually I had to expand it so that it was not just letters, and it had to have like other other. It was actually I started it off basically just as a series of letters from Ryder to Mokoya, and that didn't work because it was a very very limited sort of like point of view for the story that I was trying to tell. So in the end, we actually got to the other person, the researcher, and it actually became from their point of view instead, and and then we had all the letters in between. So it was it was a much more complex and a much better book, and it actually worked this time, and we got to do a lot of interesting things with the typesetting and like censoring stuff in the book itself, which was very interesting for me. And it was like a good way for me to explore the kind of sort of information control that sort of like overbearing authoritarian states kind of enact, because I kind of live in an overbearing authoritarian society, which I kind of like ran into repeatedly in my career as a journalist. Because I think I'm not sure if people know, but if you don't, you're gonna know now. Singapore is one of the is I think something like 150 out of the 180 countries of the World Press Freedom Index. We are just like at the bottom, just like 20 steps away from North Korea, which was interesting. It was interesting to work as a journalist in this environment, because like it's basically just working for the government. You are just literally a government mouthpiece, and you see how all that works, and it's all very regimented. Like it doesn't feel like you're doing evil, you're just doing like a day job, and they're just like, okay, oh, it's a call from the ministry telling me to edit the headline because we used one word they didn't like. Okay, I won't do it. It's just you just do it. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, I don't think I knew that Singapore was so low on that list.
It is very low because we don't have a free press. Basically, all it's one of the things where Singapore cannot hide how restrictive it is. Like we otherwise we're like we're absolutely great and fantastic, and because we are like this capitalist sort of like success story, from a sleepy backwater colony to one of the financial and trading hubs of Southeast Asia, blah blah blah. But I hit a button and all the windows disappeared. Sorry.
Oh no, I can still see and hear you. It's okay.
Yeah, no, I accidentally touched my keyboard and hit the button that will hide everything and show you your desktop.
no.
And I was like, no, wait, come back. But yeah, so it like I think the press freedom thing is the one place where we can't hide how much like control. Like people always joke about Singapore as a nanny state, and it's like, oh, it's fine. The government just tells you to do whatever, and we have like extremely restrictive laws about stuff, and people are just like, okay, we'll just deal with it, I guess. But like the whole thing about press, when you have people who actually externally like check and monitor these things, is where we usually end up like, oh God, you guys really don't have any freedom of to say what you want, and we're like, yeah, we don't.
Goodness.
Yeah, because like if you're a blogger and you say something that pisses off the prime minister will actually personally sue you.
Oh my goodness, that must have been so frustrating to be a journalist in that situation.
It is very frustrating. It's the reason why I kind of burned out after a year. It was really exciting for me because I have no journalism background. I was kind of like hired by my boss, because at that time we were sort of like doing the transition from like print only to like sort of like social media is where the news happens. This was in like 2011, and that was around. It was like sort of like a pivot where like more news is breaking up over Twitter and Facebook because people are just using these outlets more often for news. So it was interesting because I was hired not for my journalistic background, but because I was someone who understood how the internet worked, according to my boss. Because I actually wrote a very angry blog post about a letter that was published in their publication, which I thought should not have been published because it was like very it was satire that was not written in good faith, and I kind of like called out the editorial decision behind that, and because of that, he was like, "You seem to know like what's up, and we need people like you to sort of like deal with our like burgeoning social media efforts," and that's how I ended up as a journalist and seeing all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, and I'm like, "Oh, okay, I live in a dictatorship. I did not know this, but I know this now."
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds like an eye-opening experience.
It is, and because this happened, like it basically informed everything it basically informs everything I write. I think I write about oppressive systems a lot, and it's because like I spent 3 years like kind of seeing how these oppressive systems happen, but in a functional way. So we live in a very functional sort of like, I always call it a benign dictatorship, because on the surface of it, it provides materially enough for its citizenship to keep everyone happy. So it's successfully it's successful on the material level, which sort of like keeps it out of the news, because as long as people are earning money, nobody cares what's going on the human rights front. Everyone has money, it's fine.
That's fair.
The streets are clean, we have running water and electricity, and like like the highest per capita number of millionaires in like the world is some shit. So it's like, yeah, it's fine that nobody gets to speak their mind and stuff like that.
Right.
It's an interesting experience. So that's kind of like stuff that influences a lot of my writing. I'm sorry, I got extremely carried away.
No, it's fine.
I structure in the Tensorate novellas at some point in this conversation, and the last one was just like a single monologue, which was very interesting to write, because then you have to write in a certain voice, and and I'm not a very voicey writer. Like in terms of dialogue, it's basically my weakest points in conversation. And it was interesting. I don't know if it was as good as I would have liked it to be, because as I said, like dialogue is my weakest point. So I don't think I actually got the voice through very clearly. But I think in the end, it was an interesting experiment to sort of go through. And so you ended up having like 4 different novellas with very, very different structures, because it was something that I wanted to play with. Rather than sort of like create a cohesive like brand for the novellas or whatever, but that's how it's ended up shaking out.
Yeah, it's so cool how much like experimentation you did with this series. It's very cool to hear about it, honestly. So go on tangents. I was very interested in everything you were saying. I'm going to take a break for just a second and tell people, one, if you have questions for Neon, you can, if you're on Crowdcast, drop them into the Ask a Question function. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, just drop them into the chat. If you have specific questions, please do that. And we will, as long as your questions are like actually questions and decent questions, then we will look at those. And also, of course, buy books. This one has just come out in a bind up of all 4 novellas, so you can just binge through the whole thing in a giant brick volume of a book. It's amazing. And you can get that on our website, tubbyandcoos.com/special order. And so yes, go and buy books, because that's why we're all here, is to celebrate books. So I just want to take a break and let everybody know, drop your questions there and buy books, because yeah, that's why we're here. And like, clearly you want these books because it's like Queers with Dinosaurs. So of course you want them. And so I have a question about so which novella did you find the easiest to write? And which one did you find the hardest to write, if you remember?
So I think I sort of like covered it, but
A
like
little
Black
bit.
Tides was the easiest to write for me because it came out almost like perfectly formed. Surprisingly enough, I'd had to do very little editing for it, so most of the stuff that you read in Black Tides was actually just from the first draft. Because I think, for some strange reason, I had the clearest idea of what I wanted the final book to be like. Because I think like I started when I started, I already had a clear idea of like what are the four different, like the different bits of like Akea's life that I wanted to go into, and like what they each of them would feel like. So by the time I actually wrote it, it actually came out more or less the way I wanted. Whereas I felt like for the other novellas, like so Red Threads was the first thing what I wrote, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I was like just muddling around with a longer format. And for the other two, they were more experimental for me. I was like experimenting with the form itself, so that was something that I had to sort of struggle with. It's on top of like struggling with plotting, because like how you bring about like a sequence of events, uh, it it's different with like different formats and stuff like that. So I think Black Text was the one where I knew what I was doing with the plot and I knew what I was doing with the structure, so they kind of just came together kind of perfectly. And I think emotionally, I also had the most clear, like sort of like through line for that book. And I think it's kind of why it's probably the most popular of the four, because you can tell that I knew what I was doing in it, and it's interesting because that was also the book that kind of like made me realize I was non-binary. So it's also my like personal coming out book. So I guess I was just like, I guess it says something that it was the most clear and like sort of like concise of the four books, because I was just like, it was also like a pivotal like personal revelation for me. So it's like it's kind of like the form of realization crystallized into a narrative in that sense. So yeah, I think the one that I had most problems with was the third book, mostly because like I don't know what, I had never really actually written anything just epistolary before. I think I'd done like one or two like really short stories, but in that format. But turns out that it doesn't actually translate when you want to do like a much longer and more ambitious storytelling straight through um epistolary, like just a series of letters. So we turned out to be more of like a found, I think it's like a found fiction thing. It's just like a pastiche that's like sort of put together. It's not pastiche, that's the wrong word, but it's a patchwork of like different narratives like pieced together from different like artifacts, like someone's diaries and reports and like yeah, letters and stuff like that, which I think ended up like working a lot better. um and I will, I think epistolary, I will still try to come back to that at a different time. But for like, a different story, one that actually lends itself to like a single person's self expressed point of view. Because I think the thing about epistolary is that it's somebody purposefully sort of like telling a story to someone else, and I think it's very interesting sort of concept to play with in terms of like how do you want to structure it, how truthful do you think your letter writer is, and how do you bring out that maybe they're truthful or they're not truthful. I think, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can play with uh, when you're working with that format. But it's something that it has to fit the story that it's telling. Like I think like if you, yeah, like I would like to write this. I think I actually do have a short story that I'm sort of like writing for an anthology that I was invited to, that will be just entirely someone's diary entries, and I think it works for that story because it's a story of somebody going to a place that they think is X, and then they get there and they realize it's actually Y, and then like it's like how do they take their personal journey discovering, going from X to Y, and I think it's quite interesting. So yeah, the so kind of like my experience of writing these stories.
Awesome. And I that's so interesting because you have, you experimented with your writing, you had like a lot of stuff going on there where you were just doing different things with your writing. And then alongside that, you had this personal journey of you like realizing uh like who you are. And I just think that's all so amazing. That, this all came out like it makes the Tensorate series so much cooler to me to like know all of this information. So now I'm gonna go back and reread the whole thing because I have to now.
I mean, I'm not complaining.
And there's a question. This is, and kind of two people had similar question. So this one was from Crowdcast. So I'm putting it up on the screen. They've read your short stories and is wondering if you're planning to write any more longer works. And then someone else had asked, can you tell us what you're working on next, which sort of goes with this? So I know you said you had a short story for an anthology.
Yeah. So the funny thing is that now that I started writing long form works, I realized I don't actually know how to write short stories, and I have no idea how I managed to write short stories in the past. So short stories is probably something that I'm not really going to go back to very much. It's like if a short story comes to me, I will write it and then I will send it to one of my like short story editors, because I do have sort of like a person who I can send my short story stories to, and Vandermeer at Tor for Tor.com publishing for online. So I will do that because I'm right now I think a lot more focused on longer works, especially novels. I just finished more or less my first novel. Like, it was a long time coming. I've been working on this since 2018. We actually sold it last year, and then I rewrote it from scratch and then rewrote it again, not from scratch, but I rewrote huge chunks of it. And then my editor has loved the last iteration. I love it, and so I'm doing like the final pass of it before it goes to production. But it will be out in hopefully September next year, but because of the pandemic and stuff like that, the publication dates have been moving around so that we don't have a fixed date for it yet. But we will soon, I hope. But it's scheduled for fall next year. So that's the Genesis of Misery. It's the first book, and we sold a trilogy, so I have to write 2 more books after that, and it will take me a while because the first book's gonna be like 4 years.
And that's like a full
partly because pardon?
Oh, I was just wondering, is that a full length or is it also?
Yeah, that's a full length, like a novel, and then I will have to write 2 more novels. So I'm a novelist now, and that will be like the bulk of what I'm doing. I'm writing novels. I do have a novella planned for writing. We haven't sold that one, but I want to write it, and it's my sort of like my monster fucker novella.
Well, I need this now, so.
which is fun. I hope, but I will. I will try. I'm kind of like in the middle of sort of like doing some like big kind of life transition stuff. So like don't think I will get started on the second book for a while. So in that sort of like in between liminal space, I'll be probably working on a novella and stuff. Short stories. I don't know how much more of that I will be doing in the future, because I realized that first of all I don't actually know what I'm doing in that space of the short story, and also because it's really really hard to publish short stories, and yeah, I just prefer working on something longer where I have space to sort of like experiment with things and tell longer stories with more complex nuances, stuff like that. Yeah.
Cool.
So does that answer both of the questions?
It does answer both of the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to all of those things. So this is going to be great. And also, just to reward the people who are still here with us watching, I don't know how many of you there are, but we are giving away a copy of the Tensorate series bind up that has just come out. So like the brick of all 4 novellas, we are giving away a copy. So I am going to post a link to a Google form in the chat here, and you can click on that, put your information in, and it's going to ask you for a password. And the password is the protector, because why not? The protector is not good, but is the password for the Google Forms. So if you're still watching, fill out that Google form, put in the password of the protector, and I will pick a random viewer tomorrow and send you the book for free. So just as a thank you for watching. So I wanted to make sure I didn't forget to mention that. So yes, I think another question someone had was if you have read or watched anything lately that you think more people should know about.
Oh goodness. I have been like in this hole of not being able to read or watch very much for the past couple of years, and I'm only slightly starting to dig myself out of the hole. So I don't think like anything that I've actually touched is something that people don't haven't actually heard about, because I have not been reading or watching anything widely. This is a terrible question, because I always
That's
feel
okay.
like, oh my god, I'm always so sure that I'll have stuff that I want to I want to like shout out, and then like when it comes to the question, my mind just goes white, and I'm like, I have never read a book in my life ever.
It's
Never,
totally fair.
no books. Yeah.
I am
I am currently reading The Map of Salt and Stars by Zane Jocado right now. It's really good. But I'm like, I'm a quarter of the way through it, because I'm slowly trying to get back to the habit of reading more often. But I'm loving it so far. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, I just in case you want me to tell you, I have almost finished She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan.
Oh yes.
Have you read that one?
No, I have not, but I will always absolutely like encourage everyone to read from like the trifecta, as they call
Oh
it. I
yes.
think they're all fantastic. Um, they're all
Yeah.
fantastic writers. I have not read the book specifically because like not reading the whole of not reading for the past 2 years, but I'm very very much looking forward to sort of like catching up, especially those three, because I'm like,
Especially those three. And if you just a quick plug, we have a transatlantic queer sci-fi fantasy book club that I have in partnership with Portal Bookshop in the UK. And the two of us do run this book club together on Discord, and then we have our meetings on Zoom. And I'm really excited because we're reading the trifecta. So we've already read and discussed The Unbroken. And we're reading She Who Became the Sun now, and then we'll read The Jasmine Throne in December. And all three authors are coming to chat with us. So we've already chatted with Sheree Clark, who wrote The Unbroken, and Shelley, who is in Australia. So on a very different time zone. Will be talking with us, and it'll be 8 a.m. my time. So that should be really fun. I will be there with lots of coffee. And then Tasha is coming. So I'm so excited that we're reading those books and talking to those authors as well. But I'm almost done She Who Became the Sun. It is so good. It's a heavy book. There's a lot in it, and a lot of politics and intrigue and all of that kind of stuff. So it is not light and fluffy, but it is so good. I've been very much enjoying it. So in case you were wondering what I was reading, just always throw that out there.
I know that. Yeah, absolutely stoked to get to reading these books. Yes.
And okay, so one last like sort of random question that I have for you is that in the Tensorate series, there are like multiple sets of twins in here, and I'm just wondering like if there's a reason why you love twins so much.
I don't know. I think it was I feel like it was something that I read as a child. Possibly like Star Wars just broke me, possibly, but I always end up writing about I think it's interesting. It's sort of like an idea, like thinking about sort of it as an identity question as well. To have someone like raised so close with you and like but be different. I think it's an interesting look at how the same environment can shape different people differently. I think that's like kind of like the crux of the question when I write about like twins, because like they talk a lot about nature versus nurture. Sorry, my brain is going, and um how how they do a lot of twin studies to sort of like understand how all these factors work in with each other. But I also think that, like people just respond differently as individuals to the same set of circumstances. So I think that's something that's very interesting to explore. I think that's kind of the draw of why I tend to write like twins a lot. But also, I don't know. I think Star Wars broke me when I was a child.
That's a great answer. Star Wars. That's like 2 words.
I
Star
don't know.
Wars.
Yeah, I was obsessed with Star Wars as a child, and I read a lot of the expanded universe books that were around in the 1990s. Showing my age here, and I think like Leia in those books, like Leia also had twins, and so that was kind of a thing that just kind of stamped in my brain that if you write science fiction, fantasy science fiction, you have to have twins in it. Yeah, like a lot of books seem to have twins. I remember Dune also had like twins somewhere, like children who were twins or something. I don't know.
Yeah, twins pop up a lot. And yeah, Leia did have twins. I really thought they were going to do that with the new Star Wars movies, and they did not. But I was waiting for Leia's twins to show up, but it just
but no.
Like, well, back in the 90s, there was
back in the
90s. Look, elder millennials are the best. That's what I say, because I am one. I'm like, yes. And there's been different words for us. For like millennials who are like
older. No, I love geriatric millennials. That's
yeah, well, you see, I prefer elder millennial because it makes me sound wise. Whereas geriatric just makes
I'm an elder millennial. Yes,
I'm like
an elder dragon, but like
exactly. Exactly. It makes me feel like a dragon or a swamp witch or something. So I'm like, yeah, elder millennial. I will take that. And like Angela says, because Star Wars is a great answer to so many questions.
Yeah, a lot of my questions, the answers to a lot of my questions, like because Star Wars broke me as a child. Yeah,
that's very fair.
Thank you, George Lucas. You broke me as a child.
You know, another movie that broke me as a child was The Never-Ending Story, which broke. Just broke.
Yeah, I remember that from the 80s.
Oh yeah,
extra showing our age.
80s. But hey, look,
millennials.
But we don't look it, and that's good. That's important. Okay, and so let's see if I have anything else. I don't think I do. So if anyone else has a question that you want to submit last minute, go ahead and do it. If not, I am going to plug books one more time because everyone should read all 4 of these novellas, and you can read all 4 of them in one book now. Yay! So pick it up from Tubby and Coos if you're watching this, because we're hosting. So you will buy this book from us if you're watching this, and you can buy that at tubbyandcoos.com/special order. And Neon, you can follow on social media. And I think it's Neon Yang on at least Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mostly Twitter is mostly for updates for now, so I don't monitor that one, but I am more active on Instagram. When I do remember to post to Instagram, I keep forgetting because like I hadn't used Instagram for a really long time. That I came back to it. I still keep forgetting to update. But yeah, you can follow me on Instagram and I post like pictures of food and mostly, and like, sometimes like when I finish stuff with my manuscript, I'm like, yay, celebrate. That's about it.
Yeah. Well, go there, and you can also follow us if you want. We're at Tubby and Coos pretty much everywhere if you don't already follow us. We're on YouTube, we're on Instagram, we're on, did I freeze up? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it looks like my picture froze, but if you can still hear me, that's great. My picture can stay frozen, and I will just say thank you, Neon, so much for doing this event. I am so appreciative, and this was super, super interesting, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your morning to talk with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, this is really fun to just chat about like these books. It's great.
Awesome. And thank you everyone for watching. And somebody did say that we are on TikTok, and we are. So Chubby and Coos on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, almost anywhere you can find us. So yes, thank you so much, Neon. Thank you so much everyone who stayed up late with us here in the US. I really appreciate it. And we will see y'all next time. Thank you so much. Have a good day, Neon.
Have a good night. Bye.
Bye-bye.